You are now watching Managing High Availability and Clustering with Power CLI. This is a part of the VMware vSphere Power CLI training course. In this lesson, first we're going to have a little primer on VMware High Availability and VMware Dynamic Resource Scheduling features. Then we're going to talk about an overview of the HA and DRS commandlets. Going to talk to you about working with clusters using Power CLI to automate tasks that you might need to do with clusters. Then we're going to talk about configuring virtual machine level clusters. And we're going to talk about resource pools. And we're going to go into some advanced cluster scenarios. First up, what is VMware High Availability? Now, this is a feature in vSphere that's designed to minimize downtime in case of a host or virtual machine outage. It's based on the concepts of clusters and monitors. A cluster is a collection of 2 or more ESX servers, and you have 2 different types of monitoring options. VM monitoring, which uses a heartbeat from the VMware Tools service, and application monitoring, which is also used in combination with the VMware Tools service, but where it's passing along additional information from a specialized application, and this will usually require an additional layer of software in order for these to work. So in combination with all these features, you can end up with a very robust environment, which is very tolerant of outages and allows you to have a really short downtime. And in addition, vMotion is a core feature that is very useful when you have ESX clusters, and this is the ability to move a virtual machine between servers in a cluster without powering off the virtual machine. Let's talk a little bit about Dynamic Resource Scheduling, or DRS. This is the ability to automate the distribution of VM workloads across a cluster. Your DRS options range from manual to fully automated. With manual, basically you have to make all the decisions yourselves about where the workloads are being placed. Partially automated will make some of the decisions. For example, when you power on a virtual machine, vSphere will take the initiative to determine the best placement for that virtual machine. And fully automated will basically, whenever it's needed, VMware will vMotion live VMs from one host server to another to satisfy various resource availability needs. And you can even tweak that using the slider, and we'll talk about how you can make some of these settings with Power CLI, of course. Another feature of DRS is a rule. You have a few different types of rules, such as affinity, anti-affinity, and VM to host assignment. Affinity is the ability to say that you want multiple virtual machines to be situated together on the same host. Conversely, anti-affinity states that you don't want 2 or more virtual machines to be on the same host. For example, if you want to ensure that there's no single point of failure in a complex multi-server environment, you might want to, for example, ensure that your database server and your application server and your web tier server are on different virtual machine hosts. That way, if one of the host servers does go down and perhaps there's some sort of fault or with vMotion and that fails to work for whatever reason, you still have your other machines that are up. If you have a cluster, a software cluster using perhaps Microsoft Cluster Services or the application level clustering, same thing. You would want to make sure that they are not on the same VMware hosts. That way, if there's a failure, then you can tolerate that failure with your cluster remaining up. Lastly, VM to host assignment. This allows you to create groupings of virtual machines and hosts and to place a rule that will ensure that they are always on a certain host. This might be important if you're doing perhaps some SCSI pass-through devices that won't vMotion well, or there's a few other reasons I can think of. Now let's look through some of the commandlets that we'll be examining in this lesson. There's over 20 that we're going to be talking about today in this lesson. The Power CLI nouns that are related to HA and DRS are advanced setting, cluster, DRS recommendation, DRS rule, HA primary VM host, and resource pool. Okay, let's talk about managing clusters. Okay, rather than read off of this screenshot, let me bring up my vSphere environment here. And what I want to show you is an example of a cluster and some of the settings which we will be working with using PowerCLI. Go down here to Edit Settings. And you can see here we have entities such as the name of the cluster, a couple checkboxes to turn off and on the HA and DRS features. And when you click on either HA or DRS, there are a further level of settings in here. And there's several items here that are related to HA. And then we have some virtual machine level specific settings. You have a setting here at the top, for example, VM restart property, host isolation response. And that's sort of the overall setting. And then you can override these settings at the virtual machine layer for an individual virtual machine to have a different behavior than the rest. VM monitoring, we talked about that, how you have VM monitoring and VM and application level monitoring. And again, it has specific settings that you can apply there. DRS, here are the settings that I mentioned earlier, manual, partially automated, and fully automated. You can definitely set these using PowerCLI. Okay, so that's most of what I want to show you right now. Let me go back over to these slides. And new cluster is an example of a commandlet which we will be going into in a moment. So the cluster commandlet, starting off with get cluster. This is used to retrieve cluster objects. Move cluster. This allows you to move clusters from one location to another. Now, if you work with clusters much, you'll know that there aren't a whole lot of different places you can move clusters. So basically, we're talking about moving them from one folder to another, or from the root of data center into a folder. New cluster allows you to create a new cluster that contain multiple ESX servers and enclose some of the features that we've been speaking about, the HA and DRS. Remove cluster will get rid of one. And then we have set cluster to modify the cluster settings. The new cluster commandlet has a lot of parameters which we're going to be talking about. This is, of course, is used to create a new cluster. It has a couple of required parameters, name and location. Location is referring to either the root of your data center, or you can put in folders, which will be the yellow folders. So let's go have a look at the magical yellow folders. So for example, I have a cluster here, which is in the root of my data center. I can right click here and go to new folder, and that will create what's called a yellow folder. And if I wanted to, I could simply drag and drop and moving that cluster from that location to that location. So that is what we're talking about for the location parameter. There's several optional parameters. There's more than this on the screen, but these are some of the more important ones. We have HA enabled and DRS enabled, and that allows you to toggle those on or off, respectively. Then we have HA failover level, DRS automation level, and these three different settings here, which I'd mentioned to you previously. Let's go ahead and go into a demonstration. I'll show you how to create and examine clusters in your environment. Okay, I have my console up. Let's take a look at some of the commandlets related to clusters, first of all. Get, move, new, remove, and set. Let's check out the syntax of get cluster. Okay, we have several different filter properties here, such as virtual machine, VM host, location name ID, and no recursion. So these are some really useful parameters here. Let's start by itself and just type get cluster. And you can see there I've got one cluster. We'll have two here after we get done with this demo. But one cluster right now, let's say get cluster, get VM. I can go backwards. I can say get VM DB, pipe it to get cluster. Or I can say get cluster VM DB. So that's how the virtual machine parameter works. And you can do similar things based on location, name, ID. And also, if you wanted to determine which cluster a virtual machine host was in, you could do it this way. And that shows you that this particular VM host is a part of the end cluster. So that's all nice and good, but now we need to figure out how to create a cluster. Let's check out the new cluster commandlet. And I went over many of these parameters with you a moment ago. Now, the only ones that are required are name and location. So let's first figure out the location. There's a couple different ways we could do this. Going back to my vSphere client, I could put the cluster inside of the root of my data center, or I could put it in a folder. I'm going to, in this case, well, I'll show you how to do it both ways. And basically, let's do new cluster, name, new cluster. That's very, very clever of me. And location, we'll say in parentheses, get data center. And what this is going to do is PowerShell will use the parentheses as an order of execution modification. So it's going to run whatever in the parentheses first. So what this is going to do is it's going to obtain a data center object. I only have one data center. I'm not connected to multiple vSphere servers. So what it's going to do is provide a single data center back to the location parameter. And we know that'll work because data center is one of a few different types of objects which are referred to as VI containers in the API. So when I hit enter like that, there you go, it's done. It's real quick. What if you wanted to create multiple clusters? There's I think I've showed the range operator to you previously, but we'll do that again because it's so handy. And we can say for each object, new cluster name cluster $_ and that's going to replace whatever's in the pipeline with that $, where the $_ occurs. And we'll do location, and let's say, well, before I do that, I'm going to go over here. So my folder is called new folder. So let's try parentheses again, get folder new, I have to put this in quotes because there's a space, new folder, and then in a closing parentheses, and then a closing curly brace. So let's see what this does. Cluster 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now these just have the default settings on them. Let's go back over here, look at the results. So you can see very easily created multiple clusters like that. Of course, if I wanted to get rid of them, it's actually easy to do. Cluster asterisk. Yep, that returns my 5. Pipe that to remove cluster. Hit enter. It's going to ask if I'm sure, which is a good thing. I'm going to say A to answer yes to all. And you can see that's actually done already. Go to vSphere. And sure enough, those extra clusters are gone. What if we wanted to create a new cluster that did not have some of the default properties? So let's go back to our new cluster. And I wanted to say, well, actually, first let's go look and see what the default properties are. So I created a new cluster, and you can see here, DRS is off and HA is off. So that's not much of a cluster at all, really. So let's do a second new cluster. Before I do that, we'll say F equals get folder new folder. Now if I hit F like so, okay, so what we're going to do is do CL equals new cluster, name, new cluster 2, and location is $F. And then I want to say, for example, DRS enabled is $TRUE. Hit enter. And you can see that was done quickly. It didn't spit out anything on the screen because, of course, I assigned the results to a variable. And there's my cluster. And you can see here that DRS enabled is, in fact, set to true. But since we didn't specify HA enabled, that one was left off. Okay, let's go ahead and get back to the slides and carry on. Okay, let's talk about the set cluster commandlet now. This commandlet is used to modify an existing HA or DRS cluster. You can use it to rename a cluster. You can modify some of the high availability settings. You can modify your DRS settings, of course. You can also use this commandlet to attach a host profile to a cluster. You can also configure the VM swap file policy. Let's go straight into a demo, and I will show you how to add an ESX host to a cluster. And then I've got another demo right after that, show you how to modify the cluster high availability settings. Okay, let's go first. I will show you in my vSphere. I used to have 2 ESX servers in my Ent cluster. I've taken that one out, put it in maintenance. You can see here my second host went to 168.1.12. What I'm going to do is show you how to take this VM host and put it into one of the other clusters. We'll use new cluster. So let's do that. First of all, we'll say h equals get VM host. Okay, now $h equals, and there it is. So what I want to do is move this virtual machine host into a cluster. So let's get a reference back to my cluster. That's actually the wrong one, so we're going to do this over again. Get cluster, new cluster. Okay, now we have our cluster, we have our virtual machine host, both in variables so that they're very easy to manipulate. Now, does anybody want to guess what command we're going to be using? It has nothing to do with clusters per se. What we're going to do is use the move VM host commandlet. So I'm going to take my host and pipe it to move VM host and use one of its parameters, destination. And we'll just supply CL as the destination. And basically, we'll do run async on that one. Hit enter. I'm given back a task object. Let me type in get task. And you can see that they're all done here. Move host into task, and that one's successful. If I go to vSphere client, you can see move host into cluster. So that was done. That was really quickly handled there. So I've got this host, and it's sitting here in maintenance mode. Obviously, I can't do a whole lot with it while it's in maintenance mode. So what I'm going to do is take it out of maintenance mode. Before I do, I'm going to move it back over to the Ent cluster because that's where my other happy host is going to be. So let's say H, and we will use the move VM host commandlet again. Destination. This time we're going to do just in the side of the parentheses, get cluster Ent cluster. Type it out like so. Hit enter. And you can see that's done very quickly. Let's do CL equals get cluster Ent cluster. And then CL pipe that to get VM host. And you can see now we've got 2 of them, and of course the second one is still in maintenance mode. Go back over here. We can see that the vSphere client does indeed reflect the very same thing. Let's take that box out of maintenance mode so that we can go ahead and configure HA accordingly. So we will do H using the set VM host commandlet and the state parameter. I forget what the values are, so we can check that easily. Connected, disconnected, not responding, maintenance. So it's in maintenance mode right now. Let's change it to connected. And you can see that a set VM host operation is in progress. We see the progress bar at the top, and that's done. Exit maintenance mode is done there, and we have our icon is successfully changed. So we have a cluster, and let's check the properties of it. Pipe this to format list. So my Ent cluster is the name there. Several different options on this. For example, HA failover level, HA restart property, VM swap policy, DRS enabled, DRS mode. So my DRS mode is set to partially automated right now. Let me show you where that is in the vSphere client. Under settings, and then DRS. And you can see manual, partially, and fully automated. Let's change this setting around a couple times. So what we're going to do is cluster, pipe that to set cluster, and we have a bunch of different options. I'm going to show you the DRS mode option, actually automation level. There are a couple of options, and you can see here it's a little confusing because DRS mode and DRS automation level, they're different, but they it looks like they're the same thing. I can explain this. In fact, I should explain it now before I continue. Let's look at the help on the set cluster commandlet, and all will become satisfactorily explained in just a moment. I'm going to page down to some of the DRS related options here. Okay, DRS mode and DRS automation level. Note that we have a line here, this parameter is deprecated. Use DRS automation level parameter instead. And this one is the one where it says you can set it to fully automated, manual, and partially automated. Now, I can't pretend to understand the thinking about why VMware made the decision that they did, but for whatever reason, they created a DRS mode parameter and then decided in a later revision of the software that they didn't like that name. Perhaps they had some excellent technical reasons for that, whatever the case may be. And it's been deprecated. So if you look back at the cluster object, which I'll do this again, pipe this to format list, DRS mode, partially automated, that doesn't actually reflect reality. Going back into our settings, you can see, looking at DRS, it's actually not partially automated. It's set to manual. So that sort of further reinforces that this is a bogus thing. So ignore that, and if you want to get tricky, there's ways to hide it from the output, but I'm not going to go into that right now. What I am going to show you how to do, though, is to change that automation level. So let's go back to cluster, pipe it to set cluster, and DRS automation level, and we will, of course, cause that error message to spit out disabled, fully automated, manual, partially, as specified by cluster, which is not really applicable here, but we are set to manual right now, so let's set it to partially automated. So I'm just going to copy that to the clipboard and paste it here. Hit enter, and it's asking me if I am sure, and I am double sure. I'm going to hit enter, and that settings change has been made. So let's go confirm it in the GUI. You can see here DRS is now set to partially automated where it was manual before. So not a lot to that. Let's also, I can actually do some more drastic things like enable, disable HA, and there's a lot of different settings on here. So set cluster. So I could, for example, I could change my swap file policy. I explained to you how I can modify the and apply rather the host profile. So for example, let's get cluster, new cluster. So now I've got both of my new clusters. If I wanted to rename them, I could, let's say, for each object. Actually, I could use a for loop, and I could say for I equals 0, and iterate that and produce an incrementing number. So I'm not going to go through the syntax of that right now, but that's something you could definitely do in order to programmatically change the name to, maybe you've got a new naming convention and you wanted to be sure that you and you want to go through and renumber everything. You could do that using a short script of probably a few lines. That's all I wanted to show you with clusters, so let's go back to the slides. All right, now we're going to talk about the DRS, or dynamic resource scheduling commandlets, such as get DRS recommendation. Let me go back to the vSphere client to show you what these recommendations that I'm talking about look like. So under DRS tab here, if you have an example, a case might be where you have several virtual machines which have a very high load, and we have a disproportionate number of virtual machines with that load scattered across your host system, such that you've got a fully loaded VM host and then one that is not quite as loaded. You can have a situation where VMware is going to suggest to you, based on your settings, which I've got, which I'll pull up here, whether it's manual and partially or fully automated. There are different scenarios here where vSphere will prompt you to, hey, you should really move virtual machine A to VM host B in order to optimize the workloads so that you don't run risk of running out or exceeding your resource limits. So very good feature, and you will see those recommendations will appear here in the GUI. So you can use the, go back to the slides, you can use the get DRS recommendation commandlet to retrieve those recommendations, and then the apply DRS recommendation commandlet to actually confirm them and make those effective. So once you use get and then combine that with apply, a vMotion will actually occur. Then we have DRS rules. I mentioned those to you earlier, how you have different types of rules, affinity, anti-affinity, and so forth. Well, there's commands for working with those. We have get DRS rule. New DRS rule is used to create them. Then we have remove and set to work with and remove an existing one and modify an existing DRS rule. Let's go into a little further detail about the new DRS rule commandlet. For example, it's got several mandatory parameters. Those are going to be name, cluster, keep together, and virtual machine. Name is pretty straightforward, obviously. Cluster is going to be the cluster to which this new DRS rule is attached. Keep together is a Boolean or a true-false value, and this is basically supplying the answer to the question, is this an affinity rule or an anti-affinity rule? The virtual machine parameter will accept multiple virtual machine objects. Now the number of them is important, and this is detailed in the help file for the new DRS rule commandlet. The VM parameter accepts virtual machine names and wildcards or objects, so it's very flexible there. If keep together is false, then you have an anti-affinity rule, and then you can specify 2 virtual machines. If keep together is true, then you have an affinity rule, and you can specify 2 or more virtual machines. So let's go into the shell, and I will show you how that new DRS rule commandlet works. Okay, let's work with the cluster object which I had created previously. That's pointing to my ent cluster, HA and DRS cluster. So what I want to do is create a new rule. Let's look at the help file for new DRS rule. And there aren't an exceedingly large number of parameters. I talked to you about name already and cluster. Enabled is a Boolean value. This can be either true or false. So you can create a rule and then disable it. Keep together, I explained to you before, and it explains how we've got here for true affinity, false, then it is an anti-affinity rule. The virtual machines, and we have run async, and that's about it. So let's use CL as our object here, and we'll pipe that to new DRS rule, name, anti-affinity, and let's say keep together is going to be false. Now, we have to have a list of virtual machines in order to work with. So I'm going to leave my shell right there. We'll go over here, and for example, we will do production 01 and 02. So I can say VM production 01, comma, production 02, and hit enter. And that's done. Let's create another one real quick. I can say affinity, and we can do keep together true. And let's go back over to, actually I know I've got a bunch of nostalgia VMs. I'm just going to say asterisk on those. Oh, I'd already created one with the same name. So let's say, actually let's do get DRS rule, and we'll fix this problem that I just created for myself. And I've got to specify a cluster. So we will do cluster $CL. Now I've got the nostalgia rule there, so let's get rid of it. And I'll pipe that to remove DRS rule. And yes, I'm sure. Now let's say that I wanted to recreate the one from a moment ago using that example there. And that will just run right through very quickly. Now let's examine the output from get DRS rule a little bit finer detail here. Pipe it to format list. Oops, I forgot my cluster again. Okay. Now I've got a couple of different rules here. And you can see the name of the cluster, the name of the rule, and information about the virtual machine. Unfortunately, it doesn't have the virtual machine names in here. Maybe this is something that VMware will improve on in the future. That would certainly be more useful than examining the virtual machine IDs. So that's how you create a new DRS rule using PowerCLI. Let's go back to the slides. Now we're going to talk about configuring virtual machine cluster settings. So let me bring up my vSphere client and I'll show you this how to get to this highlighted portion here. So we have our cluster right here. Let's go back to Summary, Edit Settings. And under HA, Virtual Machine Options is a sub-item there. You can see here that we have options by virtual machine related to our VM restart property and our host isolation response properties. Under DRS, there are some similar options under virtual machine options, and this allows me to modify whether a certain virtual machine is going to be treated as fully automated down to manual, or whether it's going to be using the default, which is the high level setting here under DRS. So as you can see, we have multiple layers of the ability to set some of these settings. You can set them at the cluster level, or you can set them or override them at the virtual machine level. So let me show you how to do that. We'll talk about doing that using not a cluster commandlet. Actually, it's a set VM commandlet. We did talk about set VM some during the virtual machine lesson. I wanted to talk about it in more detail, specifically related to how it affects clusters. So what we talked about previously was how you can use it to modify basic settings such as your memory or number of CPUs in your the virtual machine. It can also be used to modify these VM-specific HA and DRS settings, which I just showed to you. So the properties related to HA and DRS are HA restart priority, HA isolation response, and DRS automation level. Let me bring a shell up and I will show you exactly how to do that. So first we need a virtual machine with which to work here. So let's do cluster, pipe that to get VM. So I've got several to choose from. I'm going to use batch. So we're going to say VM. Actually, we're not going to do that. What we're going to do is just say get VM batch, pipe that to format list. And well, let's look again at the help file for set VM. And we've got several different options here. Okay, here we go. HA restart priority, HA isolation response, and DRS automation level. So let's say that this batch virtual machine, I wanted to set its DRS automation level to manual. I want to be certain, perhaps there's an operation on this virtual machine that is very, very sensitive. It's not very robust, and if it gets even the most minute of network interruptions, such that can happen during vMotion, then my batch process will fail. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, yes, I've got this cluster. It's got the settings for most of my virtual machines, but I've got one exceptional case where I've got to be certain that no matter what else happens, this batch VM cannot be vMotioned without my explicit, knowledge, and I need to be involved in that process. So what I'm going to do is take this virtual machine, this batch virtual machine, pipe it to set VM and let's say DRS automation level. And again, you can force PowerShell to tell you the options. And I'm going to say copy manual to the clipboard and paste it there. And it's asking if I am certain. So that procedure will begin. And let me see if I can pull up the vSphere client. And it just finished it. So it actually did it 2 different operations you can see here. It reconfigured the virtual machine and then it reconfigured the cluster. So let's go into the settings and verify what just happened. Under DRS, And then virtual machine options, batch is now set to manual. Now what if I wanted to do this to multiple virtual machines? Could not be simpler. So let's modify one of those HA properties to, let's go back up to my, scroll up to my list of virtual machines. So let's say that my inf.atl VMs need to have a different HA setting. So I want to change the restart priority. I want to be sure that these come up first in the case of a disaster and one of my ESX hosts dies and I've got to, vMotion has to take over. Well, I want to make sure that these inf.atl VMs come up first. So I'm going to modify their HA restart priority. Very practical need for doing that sort of thing. So what we're going to do is start with get VM inf.atl asterisk, and we'll just say set that to VM, and then pipe that to set VM a-ha restart priority, and I don't remember what this one's set to. I think it takes numbers, but let's see what it says. So this is actually set to disable low, medium, high, or cluster restart priority. Cluster restart priority is basically saying I don't want to override anything. I want to set it to whatever the cluster is set to. But in my case, I want to set them to high. So let's do that here and say yes to all. And that shouldn't just take but a moment. Let me go to the vSphere client. And you can see in progress, it's configuring the cluster. Scoot that up a little bit. Cluster and virtual machine each time. So I think most of that work is done. Let's check. No, it's about halfway done, almost halfway done. You see it says 40%. So let's go back over to the vSphere client. There we go. You can see those are trickling through. And now it is all done. So let's go check to see how that setting looks in the GUI. Go to Edit Settings, under HA, Virtual Machine Options, and here it is right here at the top. So it's super easy to work with multiple objects using Power CLI. You just pipe them to set and it just works out. So that's a great way to do that. And that's all I wanted to show you with modifying VM cluster settings. So let's move on. Now we're going to talk about how to work with resource pools using Power CLI. Resource pool is a pool of resources. Could have guessed that one. Let me show you where these show up under the vSphere client. A resource pool can be in one of a few different locations. I've got a couple here that are nestled inside of one of my clusters. You can see I named them Marketing and QA. That's just totally arbitrary. If you go to the settings down here, we have settings related to the CPU and memory, in my case, and low, medium, high. On shares, we have the ability to modify reservations and limits for both memory and CPU. Let's go back to the slides. I'm going to show you how to modify some of these settings using commands such as set resource pool. Let's go into the list of the commandlets that are available. Get resource, of course, that's going to let you retrieve all the resource pool objects in your vSphere environment. You can use move resource pool to move them from one location to another. And don't forget that you can nest resource pools, so using move resource pool might be an easy way to sort of manipulate your environment and create that nested effect if something that you're into. You can use new resource pool to create, and then we have remove and set. Of course, you guys should know the verbs by now and what they do, and we're working with resource pools, so very easy. That's one of the best things about PowerShell is that consistency with the naming. Once you understand the verbs and you understand the nouns, you can apply that to other commandlets, other snap-ins. So let's go into the new resource pool command a little more deeply. It has a couple of mandatory parameters. They are name and location. So in that essence, they are similar to clusters, which had the same set of mandatory parameters. We have many optional parameters related to that dialog box with the settings, which is here on the right-hand side. You have the ability to modify CPU limit, reservation, and shares, and then memory limit, reservation, and shares. I'll show you what the names of these parameters are in just a moment. Note that in version 4.1 of PowerCLI, storage and network I/O controls are not yet supported. I'm certain that that will make it into a future version. Obviously, those are very important features with vSphere 4.1. So let me show you how to work with creating resource pools and then modifying them. So let's go to the shell. Okay, so we've got our shell up, and let's use the get resource pool commandlet. Resources, and then QA and marketing. So you might wonder, what the heck are these resource pools? I didn't see a resource pool by that name. So the way to explain that is a resource pool. There's a few different kinds of resource pools, and there's default resource pools. Clusters have a default resource pool, and I have 3 clusters. So that answers that question. So that's why I have 3 here named resources. So if I wanted to, for example, get cluster, new cluster, get resource pool, you can see there that's that hidden, if you will, hidden resource pool that I mentioned. So every cluster has a resource pool, and that's why we see them in this list. Let's look at the settings of get resource pool. VM, location, name, ID, and no recursion. So if you wanted to, this is a practical use for no recursion because, as I said before, you can have resource pools inside of resource pools, and I'll show you how to do that in PowerCLI in a moment. No recursion would allow you to get, for example, just the parent resource pool and not get the ones that are underneath it, if you can imagine that in a hierarchical tree of resource pools. So if I wanted to just get one resource pool, say QA, just do that quickly like that using the name parameter. And I showed to you the location parameter. I use that implicitly right here. Get cluster, pipe it to resource pool. What that did was in the background it said, hey, cluster is a VI object. Get resource pool has a parameter named location, which accepts VI containers. A cluster is a VI container, so it mapped those. That's how the PowerShell pipeline matching the pipeline by, there's a setting there that's okay, yes, I will try to map this by object type, and that's how that works. So you could also do it by virtual machines. Let's say I wanted to get VM. Let's go look at my screen here. Okay, I don't actually have anything in there, so I'm going to take these app VMs and move them to my QA. There's my VMs, move VM, and I'm going to say destination is get resource pool QA, and that should be a quick setting change to make. 1, 2, then it's done. Now, if I wanted to say get VM app, pipe that to get resource pool, now it's going to show me the resource pool that those 2 virtual machines are a member of. And I could do this differently. If I wanted to say, show me multiple virtual machines and their respective resource pool names, I could do that. So before I do that, let me show you how to create a new resource pool. So here are some of the settings that we have. As I mentioned to you before, name and location are the mandatory ones. So let's start off with a location of, we'll use my cluster, my existing cluster, which is still $CL. So let's do new resource pool, location, CL. And the name is, let's say, infrastructure. Okay, that's easily done. And let's create another one, just call it databases. And we'll say RP equals. So now you can see that instead of output to the screen as above, the output was assigned to this variable, and there it is. So let's take RP and pipe that to format list. And you can see here many of the settings that are exposed using the VI client, such as CPU shares level, number of CPU shares, reservation, and several other settings related to CPU. And then again, the same thing related to memory limits and shares and reservations. So it is an easy thing to modify these settings We'll do that using set resource pool. And all of these settings are, I think we have almost every parameter here is the same as the new. Let's scroll up a little bit. New resource pool. They're basically the very same settings. So let me show you back on the VI client what these settings correspond to in a little bit more detail. Let's go to the settings of my QA. So I showed this to you before. So for example, I'm going to scroll back and forth. CPU shares level corresponds to this number right here. We have, let's see, shares level is the number. We have custom. Okay, so let's look at the help for the shares level. So let's say help set resource pool parameter, and we'll just say CPU shares level. PowerShell will pull out the help just for that one commandlet, and you can see here that the options are custom, high, low, and normal. And then so that's actually this box right here. And then this box right here where the number is, that's going to correspond to num CPU shares. So let's say that I wanted to take this resource pool that I just created. I want to set the level to custom and then the number of shares to a certain number. So I'm going to cancel out of that. Right now it's set to normal and 4,000. So let's say I want to set to custom. So I'm going to take my RP, pipe that to set resource pool, and we will use the CPU shares level custom, and then the num CPU shares 8,000. And you could see that is already done. And I was working with the DB resource pool, so click on that. And you can see here it says custom and 800. So that is the way that you would want to set that. There's several other properties here, limits, reservation, shares. They all work similarly. And you can see here by this listing and in the help file what type of object that they are looking for. Some of them want numbers. So int 64, that's talking about a 64-bit integer, which is a big number indeed. Memory expandable reservation is a Boolean. CPU expandable reservation also is a Boolean. So you can easily understand what's Boolean and what's not. Those are the checkboxes. So if you wanted to uncheck this box, you would set it to false. So let's say DB RP rather. Pipe that to set resource pool. Go to CPU expandable reservation, set that to false. And that modification was done super quick. And we'll go over to settings there, and that checkbox under CPU resources expandable reservation has been unchecked. So let's go back to the slides. This next section is something that I'm excited to be teaching you about because it's a real world type of situation, and I'll explain what I mean in a second. We're going to talk about advanced cluster configuration. Here's a dialog box. Let me bring it to you, the vSphere client. We're going to go to my cluster and then edit settings. And I'll show you where the advanced settings that I'm talking about are. Right here under HA, there's an advanced options dialog box. And you can see here I have a couple of things that we'll be working with momentarily. And under DRS, there's actually a second one. I don't have anything in there. But anyway, this is the dialog box that I'm talking about. Let's go back to the slides. There are commandlets, of course, for working with these settings. They are called the advanced setting commandlets, and starting with get advanced setting, you'll use this to retrieve the advanced setting objects for a vSphere object. New is used to create a new advanced setting. Then, of course, we have remove and set. And this is the real world example that I was talking about. You may have run into this yourself, but let me show you the KB article from VMware. There's a couple of them that I have flagged for you. This one's titled Setting Multiple Isolation Response Addresses for VMware High Availability. Long story short, say that in your environment that there is a single point of failure at the gateway. but you have an alternate path where your virtual machines could still have some functionality. So you want to be sure that if the gateway does fail, that your ESX servers don't fail over and institute a vMotion, because you know the way that your network is configured, that the VMs might still be up. Maybe the gateway went down and vCenter couldn't get to it, but the virtual machine server is still up and you just had a failure at the gateway. You can provide for this by using something called the DAS isolation address. So this article explains what they are and how they work. You're basically giving the option for the HA service to check multiple IP addresses, so that if one of them fails, we'll check the next one. And if that fails and there are no more isolation addresses to check, then it will go ahead and do a vMotion. Otherwise, it'll keep checking and going through those until it finds one that is successful, and that allows you to have a more flexible HA environment. So let's go back over to the slides, and there's another one here, Advanced Configuration Options for VMware High Availability. I'm not going to click on that one, but that one shows you a lot of other examples for settings that you might need to change. You never know, you might open a support call with VMware and they advise you to make some of these settings changes. Maybe you've got to do it to 10 clusters and you're thinking, oh geez, how am I going to make this settings change across 10 clusters and doing it in a consistent manner, so on and so forth. Well, Power CLI is the answer to that. I do want to note that as a version 4.1 of Power CLI, only cluster advanced settings are supported. So if you go through your vSphere client and you can see that you've got a virtual machine, it has advanced options. The VMware host itself has advanced options. Those you can't set using these commandlets yet. I have been told that will happen. But the clusters are probably some of the more frequently used ones that you would set anyway. Let's talk a little bit about the new advanced setting commandlet. It has a couple of mandatory parameters: name, value, and entity. They correspond to, right here, the name corresponds to the option, and the value corresponds to, of course, the value heading right here. Entity is going to be the object on which you want to make these settings changes. So in the case of a cluster, we're talking about a cluster object, and it's going to be your entity. Let me take you to the shell, and I will show you how to configure the cluster DAS isolation address settings. Okay, so let's start out with our cluster $CL, which is my ent cluster, and we will pipe this to get advanced settings. And you can see there that I've got a couple. Let's pipe that as well to format list. So we can see here a couple of pieces of information. The value and the type is going to be cluster HA as opposed to cluster DRS, which I had shown you that it also had advanced settings dialog. The entity is reference to that's the ID number for my cluster. And then we have the name, which is the name of the value in question. So let's say that I have set two of these isolation addresses, and I know the name here basically by reading that KB article. I know what this value should be. And if I want to modify the values in here, I can do that using Power CLI. If I want to add a third or delete one of these, I can definitely do that. So I'll tell you what we're going to do is actually remove these first. And say yes to all. And then I'll show you how to create them again. So I just copied the DAS isolation address 1 to my clipboard, so I'll be able to easily reference that later. Let's go to our, and I don't see anything showing up in the tasks yet, but that will come shortly. Okay, got my cursor back. Let's run this again, the get advanced setting, and see what we see. Nothing. So let's start back with cluster and do new advanced setting. And my options are name, value, and entity. Entity is going to be mapped over the pipeline. So we'll just do name, and that's going to be DAS isolation address 1, and then value is going to be, for example, 192.168.1.1, which is my gateway. So it says type parameter is mandatory. So let's type, and let's say foo. And it's telling me here that the possible enumeration values are cluster HA. So that's real helpful. Okay, so now I've got my type set to cluster HA. Yes, I'm sure. So if I go back into vSphere Client, go to my cluster settings, and then click on HA, and then advanced options, you can see there it is, the 1. So if I were to type, for example, copy this to and 192.168.1.1, hit OK, hit OK. Oh, that's interesting. It wouldn't let me do it because the value has to be unique, of course. And we'll set that to 2. There we go. Go back to the shell. If we do our get again, might not have become effective. Let's pipe that to format list. So this is the second one that it retrieved, and it didn't retrieve the first one. Okay. Of course, I see what I did. If I go back to the vSphere client and look at the HA advanced options, what I did was I used 1 both times. So I just want to show you how you can quickly round trip this and get the, okay, it showed up down here. That's interesting. Okay, so now I've got my 1 and my 2, hopefully. Let's go back into settings, and then HA, and then advanced options. You can see they're both there. Now I should see them under get. Okay, and if I want to add a new one, we do cluster, pipe that to new advanced setting. And so on and so forth. We've already done new. Let's do set. So we can do AS equals, now $sign AS 0 is equal to, it's actually hard to read that. This is the dash isolation address 1. Let's say that I want to modify it. We'll use set advanced setting. And let's say we want the value to, we're just going to change the IP address. So, and yes, I'm sure. So that's all there is to it. So as you can see, this is a pretty handy thing to do, and there's definitely situations where you're going to need to change a setting like that across multiple servers or multiple objects. So Power CLI will let you run through that list really quickly. Say that you had you want to make that settings change on multiple clusters. Super easy to do with Power CLI. So we've come to the end of managing high availability and clustering with Power CLI. Let's do a quick review. First, we talked about what is VMware High Availability and VMware DRS, gave you a little primer on those. And then we talked about the HA and DRS commandlets. Then I went into detail about managing clusters using the set cluster, new cluster, remove cluster, and so on commandlets. And I talked to you about how each of these cluster-related settings, HA and DRS, have corresponding settings related to each specific virtual machine. And we talked about how you can automate changing those settings. Then I talked to you about resource pools and how you can create and modify those using Power CLI. And lastly, we talked about advanced cluster configuration.